London, 1803. Inside a townhouse on Bishopsgate, a group of men sit around a table with maps of a continent none of them have ever set foot on. They are not diplomats, they are not soldiers, they are bankers, and in the next few minutes they are going to decide the shape of a country that on paper cannot afford to exist yet. You were taught that the Louisiana Purchase was a real estate deal. Napoleon needed cash, Jefferson wanted land, and for $15 million, the United States doubled in size overnight. Clean, simple, the greatest land deal in history, they call it. It wasn't a bargain, it was a loan. The United States government did not have $15 million, it didn't have five. What it had was a signature, a promise, and a banking house 3,000 miles away willing to turn that promise into cash a bankrupt French treasury could actually use. This is the story of how two of America's most celebrated territorial victories, Louisiana in 1803 and Alaska 64 years later, were never purchases in the way you were taught. They were debt, and the pattern they set never really went away. Here is the version most of us grew up with. Napoleon Bonaparte, staring down a costly war with Britain and a failed campaign to reclaim Haiti, decides the vast Louisiana territory is more trouble than it's worth. He offers to sell not just New Orleans, which American negotiators actually came to buy, but the entire 828,000 square miles of it. Jefferson's envoys, stunned, say yes on the spot. Congress ratifies it. America pays $15 million and the frontier is born. What that version leaves out is the state of the country doing the buying. In 1803, the United States government was, by any modern standard, fragile. It had no reliable central bank. Its tax revenue came almost entirely from tariffs, and there was no meaningful domestic bond market. The entire federal budget that year was a fraction of what $15 million represented. Asking the government to simply write a check for the Louisiana Territory would have been like asking a man renting a one-room apartment to pay cash for a skyscraper. So how do you buy a continent with no money? You don't, you borrow it. And to borrow at that scale, you don't go to Congress, you go to London. The name that almost never makes it into the textbook chapter is Baring Brothers. By 1803, Baring Brothers was one of the most powerful merchant banking houses in Europe, a firm so influential that decades later, one European statesman would half-joke that there were 6 great powers in Europe: England, France, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Baring Brothers. Founded by Francis Baring, the firm had spent decades building the kind of cross-border credit and trust that few institutions in the world could match. Here is the mechanism most people never learn. The United States agreed to pay France $15 million for Louisiana. But France, mid-war with Britain, didn't want $15 million in American IOUs sitting untouched in a Paris vault. France needed usable capital immediately, so the deal required a second transaction hidden inside the first. The U.S. government issued bonds, federal debt, worth $11,250,000, bearing 6% interest. Baring Brothers, working with the Dutch house Hope and Company, agreed to purchase those bonds directly from the French government. France sold its claim on American debt to European bankers at a discount, and those bankers paid France in cash up front. Baring and Hope then resold the bonds to investors across Europe, collecting interest as the United States slowly paid them back over the following years. Hold on to this number because we come back to it: $11,250,000, not paid by America to France, paid by a British-Dutch banking syndicate to France on America's behalf in exchange for decades of American taxpayer-funded interest flowing back across the Atlantic. The United States did not buy Louisiana. 2 European banking houses financed a war-torn French government's cash crisis, and America spent the next 15 years paying off the mortgage. There's a bitter irony here, too. Britain was, at that exact moment, at war with France. A British merchant bank had just helped bankroll Napoleon's war chest, because at that level, business answered to different loyalties than the ones printed on a flag. Now fast forward 64 years, and watch the same pattern repeat under a different name. By 1867, the United States is a different country, richer, more industrialized, fresh off a civil war that had, ironically, forced it to build the financial infrastructure it lacked in 1803, a real system of federal bonds and a national banking system. Secretary of State William Seward negotiates the purchase of Alaska from Russia for $7,200,000. Congress, skeptical of what critics mock as Seward's folly, nearly refuses to appropriate the funds at all. Here the story shifts. Unlike 1803, the United States could technically raise $7 million from its own treasury by 1867. But even here, the money didn't simply appear from a surplus sitting in a vault. It came through the same instrument the country had leaned on for 6 decades, government bonds, sold into a market that, even by the 1860s, still ran heavily through London. The country that once needed foreign banks to lend it money outright now needed foreign and domestic bond markets to absorb the debt it issued to cover the payment, a subtler version of the same dependency, dressed up as fiscal independence. Here's what most people miss about Alexander Baring specifically. He wasn't a distant financier signing papers in a London office. Baring personally traveled to the United States, cultivated relationships with American statesmen, and positioned his firm as the indispensable bridge between a cash-hungry young republic and the capital markets of Europe. He understood something the American negotiators could not solve alone. Sovereignty is worthless as collateral if nobody with money believes you'll pay it back. Baring's real product wasn't cash. It was trust, manufactured and sold at scale. On the French side, the man effectively brokering the resale was François Barbé-Marbois, Napoleon's Minister of the Treasury, who understood exactly what he was doing when he arranged for American bonds to change hands for hard currency rather than waiting years for Washington's slow annual payments to trickle in. On the Alaska side, 6 decades later, the power players are less individual bankers and more the machinery of a maturing Treasury Department, alongside a Congress deeply suspicious of foreign entanglement, a suspicion that had been earned. Some members of Congress in 1867 explicitly invoked the memory of how deeply European finance had reached into American sovereignty during the Louisiana debt years, using it as an argument against the Alaska appropriation. They lost that argument, but the fact it was raised at all tells you the pattern of 1803 hadn't been forgotten. It had simply been normalized. There's a specific moment in this story worth sitting with. It isn't Jefferson signing a treaty, and it isn't a flag raised over New Orleans. It's quieter, bond certificates, physically printed with the promise of the United States government, changing hands in European financial houses, subdivided and resold among investors who had never set foot in Louisiana and never would. That is the moment American territorial expansion stopped being a story about land and started being a story about paper. From 1803 onward, the growth of the United States was never purely a matter of negotiation and settlement. It was underwritten by interest-bearing obligations that tied the nation's future tax revenue to investors abroad. Every acre of the Louisiana Territory carried, invisibly, a 6% interest rate attached to it for years after the ink dried on the treaty. Here's the part that closes the loop on that number from earlier. $11,250,000, financed by Baring and Hope, at 6%, meaning the United States didn't simply pay $15 million for Louisiana. By the time the last bond matured and the final interest payment cleared, the true cost of the deal, once financing is accounted for, came out closer to $23 million. The mortgage cost nearly 50% more than the sticker price. That's the number the textbook chapter never shows you. So why does any of this matter now, more than 2 centuries later? Because the mechanism didn't disappear. It became the default. Every major expansion of American territory or capacity after Louisiana, the Mexican Cession, the Transcontinental Railroad, 2 world wars, the interstate highway system, was financed the same way. not through cash sitting in a treasury vault, but through debt issued to investors, foreign and domestic, betting on the future taxing power of a growing nation. Louisiana wasn't an exception to how America builds itself. It was the template. The deeper lesson isn't really about bonds or interest rates. It's about what sovereignty actually costs. The United States in 1803 wanted to be treated as a serious, permanent nation-state, and to be taken seriously by the empires around it. It needed access to capital it did not itself possess. That access came with strings, measured in interest payments, that quietly outlasted the men who negotiated the original deal by decades. The next time you hear a national milestone described as something a country simply bought or achieved, it's worth asking the same question this video started with: who actually supplied the capital, and on what terms did they expect it back? Because more often than history textbooks let on, the answer isn't a treasury. It's a ledger, sitting in an office thousands of miles from wherever the flag eventually gets planted. If you've been paying attention to this channel, you already know this isn't the only place this pattern shows up. So here's a question for the comments. What other purchase in history do you suspect was actually a loan wearing a treaty's clothes?